So, welcome to this giant throng gathered here today. God, that pisses me off. But live the joke, Vince. I'd say live the joke. So we're going to talk about VR and AR and MR and its association with news and non-scripted content. So this is the first panel that I've ever done in these some 40-odd years that I've done these panels where I've never done with anyone on this panel, ever even, I've only met Michael, so I don't have a clue where this conversation is going to go. But it's going to be about VR, and we don't need to ask people whether they know what VR is, because I'm sure they already do. So joining us is Jason Farkas, who runs VR for CNN, so has a lot of things to tell us about how that news organization is using VR and AR and whatever new methods that are out there, what's coming down the pike, and where are we going with it. And next to him is Meegan, who is a VR filmmaker with JAUNT, and I think it was just last week you won an Emmy Award for a really incredible, I want to say documentary in VR. It's kind of a documentary, but we can talk about that in a minute, called Collisions. You really want to see it, you can go to JAUNT and get it and look at it. It's fascinating. We'll talk about what that is. Next to him is Michael Santiago, and Michael is with Laduma. Thank you, Laduma, for sponsoring the panel, giving us the Google Cardboards, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Michael is a business development executive there and has the unenviable task of trying to sell VR out. And Michael Dutton has kind of that same unenviable task. And he is Senior Vice President with Mesmerise, that are located in London and here in the United States, and one of the founding members of Mesmerise, a friend of mine who was the head of digital at Sky News, Andrew Hawken. And so there's a sort of in the bones of the company, there's journalism and there's non-scripted. And then joining us at the very end of the panel, but absolutely not the end of the conversation, is Erika Barraza. Erika is a VR entrepreneur and has an interesting new venture, which is sort of off the point of news and VR and exactly on point. So when we get down to the conversation, we'll talk about why I think that's kind of a little bit of a quasi sort of two sides of the coin business that you've got happening there. Jason, tell me a little bit about what CNN does in VR and what you're planning on doing with it and how it's being accepted.
Sure. For the last 2 years, we really wanted to make 360 video a core competency throughout our whole organization. We really feel like we need to produce virtual reality at the speed of news, which two and a half years ago wasn't possible. The technology wasn't there. It was too expensive. It took too long to process the footage and to stitch. But in that time, the technology's come such a far way that we now have 15 bureaus around the world, which is about a third of our total bureaus, by the way, but 15 bureaus around the world that are equipped with 360 video hardware, that have producers that are dedicated to virtual reality content creation. And we really believe that this format, that 360 video and VR as an offshoot, or vice versa, is probably the most intense medium that you can express a journalistic story in. And so as soon as it sort of came on the scene, we pivoted towards making VR part of the core mission of CNN and covering breaking news in that experience. Because when you're watching people struggle in the middle of a hurricane, or watching a riot take place at the Republican National Convention or in Charlotte or what have you, there's a sense that you cannot actually experience that through a fixed frame of video. Whether you're watching on your phone or your TV, to experience it, you really need 360. And we saw that power immediately, and so we've built our organization kind of around producing this in the same way that we produce digital content and television content.
Great. I have questions about the ethics of VR journalism, but I don't want to have that happen right now. So everybody that's sitting out there, there's a pair of Laduma branded Google Cardboard. If you go to not the App Store, Google Play right now, you can download the VR journalism app. On the VR journalism app is content from people on the panel, And I don't have the URL for JAUNT. We can talk about that in a minute when we talk to Patrick about it. And I want you to see Collisions. It's a fascinating story. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that, Patrick?
Yeah, sure. So we actually shot Collisions almost 2 years ago now, working with director Lynette Walworth and independent producer Nicole Newnham. And it's the story of an Aboriginal elder in the outback of Australia, and basically the story of his first encounter with Western civilization, which turned out to be an atomic bomb test by the British military. And so from his perspective, he was witnessing the manifestation of a god, and it was really about kind of the story takes you through sort of the thought process and the evolution of his experience as this god turns out to not be providing for him, but actually destroying some of the people around him. And so the title Collisions kind of comes from this collision of a very traditional culture clashing and colliding with Western civilization in this way. And part of the interesting aspect of working with the Aboriginal people is this idea that Aboriginal people view the landscape in a very kind of almost 360 way. They have an incredible sense of the space. They, have this particular man, Neary, had traversed the entire continent on foot at least 2 or 3 times throughout his life. So they have an incredible spatial awareness. And when we actually brought our camera there, which at the time was sort of a prototype camera with 16 GoPros, he immediately sort of understood what we were doing. And I think that was sort of in a way, Lynette, the artist, had known of his story for a long time, but felt that it wasn't until the VR medium started to come around that this would be the appropriate way to tell this story. And basically what we do is we travel you, give you, the subjectivity of the piece really evolves traveling, you as a passenger traveling to this community, you encountering Neary, and eventually you are actually put into his actual point of view as we have an animated sequence that recreates the bombing. And we also kind of just discuss the kind of connection with the land that the Madu people or the Aboriginal people have, and sort of the way they use fire to control the land.
It's a fascinating study, and absolutely something you definitely want to go and grab and look at, use the Go Cardboard, listen to it with headphones, because one of the things that struck me right in the first time I saw it was the incredible use of spatial sound. Mm-hmm. It sounded like it was spatial sound. I'm not sure that if it was, you were at the leading edge of the technology there, because things would happen and you'd hear Neary's voice and you'd wonder where it was coming from. You'd have to turn around to find him. There was another sequence in there, and you talk about the bombing, the bombing being the explosion of the atomic bomb, and how the people felt that as the kangaroos fell over because of the blast, that God was bringing them something great, and they could go and grab the kangaroos and then have them for dinner, and boom, the end of that story. Anyway, we'll talk about that, because I think there's also some ethical issues in there. So we've talked a little bit about news coverage. We've talked a little bit about not necessarily news coverage, but it's almost documentary filmmaking in VR. So Michael Santiago from our host Laduma has an interesting perspective from the business development perspective, but also taking a look at VR as your company shifted from being something primarily sports-oriented to something that isn't necessarily primarily sports-oriented anymore. So you're navigating this landscape in a different way. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting about when we talk about virtual reality or augmented reality, MR, that kind of stuff. It truly is at its core an art form. It's designed by creative people, and now taking that to sometimes industries that aren't inherently creative is sometimes a difficult task. And so we learned very early on that working with sports organizations could be difficult sometimes, because their vision of what they wanted to create, the world they wanted to create, or what they wanted to show, the story they wanted to tell was a little bit different than how you would film in 360 video. And sometimes they would want something that we would maybe view as unauthentic. where that's one power of virtual reality, is creating such an authentic visual experience with the medium and with the subject matter. So we've definitely had to migrate our path and who we've worked with, in part because we have a creative team that is passionate about what they do, and we've found that from a B2B standpoint, if you're taking a very creative kind of art form and then trying to find businesses and ways that they can, see value in it, you sometimes have to morph and be nimble in how you strategically go after those markets. And so we've gone from sports to filming heart surgeries and creating experiences for hospitals and medical device companies, and doing travel content. So there's we've definitely migrated in our approach, and have done our best to kind of find the best industries who can kind of collaborate with our vision, so that we have a sense of authenticity to the creative approach that we believe in, while still trying to give a business case for it.
So, conversation to be had after we've gotten through everybody, and a couple of setup questions to be had about how do you go about selling a VR project to a client? What is the best sort of approach? What makes a good client for VR? Obviously, again, we're talking about news journalism, non-scripted. So, Michael Dutton, who comes from Mesmerise, which has a decidedly journalistic bent, at least at the beginning of the company. Where do you fit in this picture with Mesmerise, being in London and here in the United States?
Well, with respect to location, this is a global universe that we live in now. So whether we work with folks in the States or in the UK, China, what have you, not so important. We've got people sort of based all over the world for that. But our focus, I guess, is twofold. One is content creation, and two is platform development. So we're seeing a lot of need on the publishing and distribution side to have an infrastructure in place for serving it, managing it, piping it full of interactivity and all of that good stuff. So there's a lot of effort there, but to get out there, you got to make it. You got to tell stories. And so we all, as you said earlier, we are, storytellers at the core. We all come from a news background. You got AP, BBC, Sky News at the founding level. We are definitely trying to use this technology in a way to enhance the overall coverage planning that these news organizations might be putting out there. But we're playing the small game with the big companies rather than a big game with everybody. We want to move forward on what's practical and pragmatic, so not overthinking the technology, not taking gear into the field that might be too big for the situation, but really come away with content that is compelling at the story level, and then using the 360 sort of spherical image as a new medium. So, we're being tactical as we can because we're a small organization, and again, just leveraging the storytelling aspect and background that we have.
Do you find that agencies and large companies feel this sort of, they're compelled to have to drop into VR more than they are compelled to be innovators and leaders in the VR space? So they have to go out and they have to bring people in to make it work for them. Unlike CNN, which has its own department, I don't see that everywhere. Do you?
Well, we've been around for just over a year, and when we set out to find partnerships to, kind of develop, we looked right at the companies that already had a repository for this kind of content. So immediately you've got a Life VR app, you've got a Virtually There app at Gannett, you've got a handful of companies that might not have big, video infrastructure and operations, more text-based, more video, more visual, photo-based. They need a team, so we went there, and we kind of came in and sort of said, look, the way we're going to get this thing done is, not going to be the biggest, highest price tag project in the world, but it's going to leverage an existing operation and enhance your overall content strategy without breaking the bank.
So, Michael Dutton, I want you to meet Erika Barraza right there, who is actually doing something in exactly that space and trying to bring something new to it. Tell us a little bit about your company and what it is that you're doing that dovetails with what we're talking about for news and unscripted content.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, my name is Erika Barraza. I'm the founder of Emerging Visual Realities. It's a marketplace for buying, selling, and licensing virtual reality and augmented digital assets. So as you mentioned, you're trying to create VR experiences at the speed of news. And we're leveraging user-generated content of virtual reality, eyewitness news accounts and things, getting it up onto the platform as fast as possible. We're verifying by integration of blockchain technologies, tracking metadata for any changes in the visual images as well as user accounts, and really leveraging the power of the crowd and the fact that the moving trend now is to be leveraging media content with user-generated content and some of the challenges that come with that. So really pulling in radical accessibility to virtual reality content creation and observation. We're building out our platform in web VR, so no one is locked out by needing to download an application. You can view things directly on the web browser.
So let me ask each of you to give me a definition of the use of VR in news and non-scripted. So if somebody were to come to you, how would you describe that to them?
Our group, we call it CNNVR, but we really see ourselves as an immersive storytelling unit because the definition is so spongy, right? Like virtual reality means, okay, I'm obscured in a headset and I have interactivity in a virtual space. AR is digital elements in the real world. MR is kind of the same thing. 360 video is not that, but it's also immersive. So, it's so hard. I think that these terms are sort of bleeding and falling into each other all the time. We actually were a little bit nervous about calling it CNNVR because we're going to have to change this in like a year. It's not going to be called that anymore. So
yeah, except we still call it TV.
We do still call it, right? Exactly. We still call it, and at the end of the day, a lot of this is also just like video of different types. But getting back to your question, like what is the? Are you asking like what is the use case effectively of this?
Just give me a definition of VR news.
VR news for us, I'm not saying for everybody on this panel, is any storytelling experience that is in 360. So that it involves an element of you are the director. As the viewer, you have agency as to where you are looking and what you are experiencing versus something that is being fed to you as a single line cut. And that's how we differentiate VR journalism from all the other forms of journalism that we do.
Well, unless you're covering an event live.
We've done 360 live, so that works as well.
Right. How would you describe it? How would you define it?
Well, I agree with the kind of blanket term of the immersive storytelling. I think it's useful to wrap these things together because they're all technologies that feed one another. But I think for me, it's VR is a first-person medium at its core, and so what you're doing is empowering the subjectivity of the audience. That being said, you're often historically as production, having done this for over 3 years, production is very difficult. So even when we're doing documentaries, I will often describe to partners that this is going to be more scripted than they might be used to, because since people will say, oh, you've removed the frame, but really you've just expanded the frame, and you're still composing. You're still, you still have to be, I think, ethical and artistic about how you compose for this spherical or even beyond that infinite frame. But at its core, I would say that you are creating a highly subjective experience or empowering the subjectivity of the audience to put them in a place or encounter a person or people.
So I'm going to stick with the two of you for a second. Don't worry, you guys. I'll get to you in a minute. But I would imagine that in the newsroom, that both of you are constantly in a newsroom or around a newsroom. I know how it's set up in New York. That there would have been some conversation about the ethics of VR and journalism. So what are the big challenges that come up in those conversations? Jason?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think that I get asked this all the time about how, you see everything, right? And you're capturing everybody. So how does that change your approach? But at the end of the day, you're still dealing with almost the same exact ethical issues as you would with traditional video and news gathering. We record all kinds of upsetting, sometimes, gory, for lack of a better word, explicit content that happens in breaking news situations or otherwise. And we have incredibly strict standards and practices that guide what we will show and why we will show it, and what is the reason for showing something that is potentially offensive or extreme or upsetting. Is there a good journalistic reason for that? And all of the same questions and rules, guidelines, really exist for 360 video as well. I think where it gets different, where it changes course a little bit, is that if someone is watching something that you've produced in a headset, they can't, it's harder for them to look away from it. They can of course close their eyes, but there's that element, and then there's also the, that feeling that you are there, that experience of being very close in proximity, and sometimes losing your sense that you're actually not there. That can be something to think about.
So I'm curious about the ratings. Can you look at the kinds of VR content that you're distributing, whether it's a live event, whether it's a documentary type event, or whether it's a news story or a piece that's been produced specifically, voiceover, stand up at the end, video in the middle, and so on, graphics designed. Is any one of those areas showing a spike in viewership?
For 360?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, that depends totally on the platform as well. We expect to get anywhere from 1 million to 5 million views on any particular piece of content that we distribute on Facebook 360. Now, CNN has, I think we've got like 40 million or 50 million Facebook followers on the main account. So, that's not an insane number when you have that many followers.
It's still a powerful number.
We're the number one social news source in the world, so that it makes it sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy to get 1 million views. On our own platform, we aim to get somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000. But there are other platforms like headsets where 10,000 in a Samsung Gear VR or 20,000, that's like a home run. And so we're like, wow, a lot of people watch this in the most immersive way that they could experience it. And for us, that actually has more sort of value to me in a way that we gave someone the full experience. We give 20,000 people the full experience rather than someone sort of maybe seeing it in their Facebook feed for 5 seconds.
Well, then of course the fact that it lives on, as does content on the internet, gives you the opportunity to go back and look at it a second or a third time and see things that you hadn't seen before because it's VR. Because I'm looking this way and then I look at it a second time, now I'm looking over there. I may be focusing on something different. One last question on this area, and then we'll carry on. In collisions, I jokingly said you didn't actually have footage of the kangaroos falling over when the bomb went off. You had to create that. So now you've moved VR coverage or a documentary's thought process, and you've added graphics into it that are a representation of something that happened back in the 50s. Opens up other questions about the use of recreations and whether or not you do or don't agree with the use of a recreation in journalism. Does that set up any questions for you ethically, or is that just the way it's got to be because of the nature of the beast?
Well, I think from the documentary standpoint, where you're shooting over a number of days and putting a piece together, I feel that it's very important to have your subject as a collaborator, so that you are, having a discussion of what you're capturing with your subject as you're doing it, if you want to portray their story. So it's, I think inevitably there is a conceit in VR that there's an inherent honesty to it because the camera sees everything, so you can't hide, and but in fact, where you place the camera can hide all sorts of things, or there's plenty of ways. In collisions, it's not just the animated sequences. We do compositing throughout you know, we've removed the tripod in every single shot. We've removed myself in many shots, or we've added skies, you know, time-lapse skies into shots.
And all of those things are essentially manipulating the imagery.
Correct. But I don't
By the way, I'm not taking a side on this. I'm just throwing out.
But I think it's in the service of the story that we're focusing on nearly the subject's story and his point of view, and in dialogue with him, we're trying to recreate his subjective experience.
But you find this to be pretty similar across a lot of the projects that you're doing. Yes, no?
I think, yes. I think it's a matter of how much time you have to work with and collaborate with the subject. You know, I think in other ways, like I had done another project in the Amazon rainforest, and there we had less time. I think what the danger is that you roll in, you put down a camera, you know, and unlike operating a camera where it's the, you know, the documentarian or news person's frame that's sort of guiding, you're just kind of letting it all speak for itself. And again, kind of portraying that this is just pure truth because you can't hide. But I think given whatever time constraints you have, I think you kind of limit your, maybe the level of opinionated statement you're trying to make. You know, we're making a real statement in Collisions and obviously siding with sort of the subject's point of view. I think the less time you have, the less of a relationship you have with your subject. I think you just need to kind of temper the expectations of, you know, of opinion in that piece.
Trump. The idea, and I just throw this out there because it's spoken about in a lot of classes, that you simply have put a camera there, automatically changes what it is you're going to record on that camera, just because the camera's there. Not that that's right, wrong, or in between, it's just a fact. So, Michael, talk to me a little bit about, let's move into the business area now. Because nobody sees VR unless somebody pays for it. And I don't think that, correct me if I'm wrong, that the business has reached a saturation point yet where it is looked at as a huge business right now. But everybody, obviously, I've read Pew reports, I've read all sorts of documentation that shows that the number is increasing in purchase of headsets. Of course, we've got the new headset that just came out, I guess it was the day before yesterday, the new Oculus headset, which doesn't require a cable, doesn't require a phone, so it's a whole new paradigm. Things are changing in the business. But it hasn't reached that sales point where everybody's got to have it. Yet everybody's got to have it. Is that what you're finding out there?
Yeah, I mean, when we were starting out a couple years ago and just focused on 360 video, the first thing you'd hear from anybody that we would talk to or meet with from a business standpoint would be, well, I don't have a headset, nor do my customers who I want to see this. And so you had to be strategic in your approach and focus on not only the creative and creating this experience that would fulfill specific business objectives, whether it be marketing objectives or revenue objectives, but then be smart in the sense of deploying the technology for the client. So at the very beginning, we would then take, say, headsets to an event or to a medical conference for surgeons to put on for a surgery that we filmed. And so we're now taking that technology there. And I think as Oculus and Facebook, Google, as a lot of companies, HP, Dell, get involved in the manufacturing of headsets and those become much more available on a grander scale, that won't be as much of an issue and that won't be something that we hear as much. But still, for me at least, my own experiences is that being able to come at, being able to mix that creative, artistic view of using these platforms, whether it be virtual or augmented reality to solve business objectives, being able to mix that business kind of case, rather than just saying, this is something new, you have to use this is what your competitors are doing, everybody loves VR, and more showing how VR is going to solve a very specific objective that they have. And so a lot of it is listening and not being a kind of a loud, obnoxious salesman who talks too much about how great VR is, but more listening and hearing where VR and AR could solve these issues. And if you could do that, I think that's where people's checkbooks open up, so to speak, and they'll go, okay, I can put money behind this.
So, Michael Dutton, before I ask you the question that's like burning right here in my chest, I want to ask you if you want to add something to what Mike Santiago just said.
Yeah, so we all started getting into this VR space, 360 space about the same time. 3 years ago when I went into meetings and I would talk about this, people would say to me, do I have to wear the headset? And they're like, do I have to wear that thing? As it was not something they were into. I mean, they didn't know anything about anything. And there's still a lot of people that just don't. I mean, when you get out into the world of media, we're still in the fringe. I mean, it's less fringy, but it's still fringe-ish. So getting the point across, getting people to understand, okay, headset works. Well, now we're 3 years later, Samsung's putting commercials on primetime TV. It's there, we get it. But the distribution and the eyeballs and the money is, still on just the tradition, Facebook, YouTube, that's where people go. So to Jason's point, it's like you can get 6 million views on Facebook and whatnot, and that's great, but 10,000 views in the headset, that's a home run. So that basically tells you the whole story. So our job is to figure out how to teach the people that we're getting to distribute the content, what it is and how it works and how much it costs, and how to get them to teach their audiences how to use it and how to experience it and why it means something to them. What can they get out of it? So when it comes to the rubber hitting the road from our perspective, the money comes ultimately from an advertiser. They're going to pay for it. That's going to pay for the production of something and so on. The advertiser's only going to get involved if they know that the audiences are there, right? So there's a understanding what they can experiment with versus what's a guarantee. That's a tough nut to crack every time, all the time.
It's funny, as you were saying that, I was thinking about, well, how do you market this stuff? I mean, in the real world of television, a television program is created, the promotion and marketing people come in and sit down in the best of all possible worlds. Vince Manzi out there was the president of the NBC agency at a time when they created marketing and promotion for their television shows. So during that period of time when must-see TV was happening, all those great shows, whether they were Seinfeld or ER or Cheers, all of those shows, they had promos that were done for them. You talk about in the news business, you'd promote nightly news in the Today Show and Nightline and things like that. How do you promote a news VR product? How do you promote that in an effective way when the end product is VR, it's not 2D? Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I think for certain events it makes sense. And I'll give you one example, and this actually intersects with your question about how to build the business around this as well. In August, obviously we knew that the eclipse was coming and that it was going to be a huge event for the country.
Is that the piece that you put on the?
Yeah, actually, it's on. Right, yeah, it's on the app. As a matter of fact, you can sort of watch a cut down of it, at least on the app, just a 2-minute sort of brief summary of the experience. But we knew that event was going to be a huge news moment, and one of the great things about something like the eclipse is that it's not breaking news, right? It's happening in real time, but it's something you can easily prepare for. So we ended up making probably our biggest bet of the year on that event. And I saw a couple of live streams in 360 of the eclipse, but we live streamed the eclipse from 7 different locations across the entire path of totality. And this operation was, when we sort of netted out what we were going to do, it was such a huge production. It was 40 satellite feeds coming into a control room in New Jersey that we had to build. Just for comparison's sake, for election night, we only used 28.
So this was a VR control room?
This is a VR control room. And we used traditional satellite feeds to basically transmit individual cameras in the field and then stitch them at the control room site. And so it required 40 different feeds going up from 7 different locations, and many of them were remote, like in Montana and all these like sort of, places where there's no internet connectivity, so it really required a satellite feed. And we put this together and we're like, wow, this is a massive production. It's going to cost a lot of money. And we managed to get a sponsor on board to help us with it. So Volvo ended up coming in and basically sponsoring the eclipse across television and across VR for CNN, and that also led, so there's the commercial part of it, right? Like if you make a few big bets, that's enough to keep our VR operation going for a couple more years to go. And on the television side, it was a perfect opportunity. We were covering the eclipse on television as it was happening, right? It was 2.5 hours or whatever it was. And they were consistently pushing to the VR experience. And we ended up with 5.7 million views in the live experience, which, by my tally is the most.
The live experience was a 360 experience.
Yes.
It's not a VR experience. So.
It was a VR, it was 360 video in VR as a headset. It wasn't a VR experience. But to be able to be there at the site of the eclipse, not just in one place, but in 7 different places across the country, was an amazing immersive moment. I thought it was, I was like, wow, this is a good use for 360. And it ended up becoming the most watched live 360, I think of all time. So it satisfied a business need. It helped us learn the promotion of how to do this live. And
a lot of people, if you were in the United States, actually I was watching it in the UK on my Slingbox, which is set up in North Carolina. Don't tell anybody. It struck me that you got a tremendous amount of marketing push out of that just by virtue of the fact that CNN has such a big footprint and people knew it was coming. So that's really important. People need to know that it's coming in order for you guys to make a business out of it.
So can I just add to that real quick? So on the Eclipse, Time magazine, we did it, one location, no sponsor, also about 6 million views. Across Facebook and YouTube. So that speaks to the promotion, like the marketing muscle of a CNN is able to go and sort of get Volvo involved. Time magazine, yes, we all know it, it's big and famous, but it does not have that push capability. But they got out what they still got out, they got it out. They couldn't monetize that 6 million views that came in, or whatever it was, 5.5 million. That's the
smart sales guy will take that number and then look at it in the future and say, well, let's figure out how we monetize this.
There's just one other point I think that's important in bringing in sponsors is the story of making that is very interesting, and we've found a lot of just the making ofs of how this stuff is done, and sponsors just wanting to be associated with innovation. And it's right now it's oftentimes the story of how it got made can be more interesting than the piece itself. Not to say that that's the case, but it's.
Speaking as a former director producer, I agree with you 100%. So I want to talk to Erika a little bit about what it's like to be an entrepreneur in this space today. So you are the sort of the purest link with a startup in the VR space right now and on this panel. Tell me a little bit about the challenges that you face as a VR entrepreneur today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some of the challenges really are that we're building systems and companies based on assumptions of hardware, available browsers, available softwares. Sometimes, like just this week, I think it was announced the Nokia Ozo is gone. So anybody who invested in that $60,000 asset is gone. So for a startup, that's a huge blow. But I think a lot of the startups who are tackling it in a really smart manner are actually leveraging the power of the collective. I think with virtual reality more so than any other industry, it's a team of people who are willing to collaborate with each other and work across.
So hold on, I want to ask you about that because it sounds like the Borg to me. The Borg, anybody get that reference? I thank you, Stacy. A couple of people here got the reference. What is the collective?
I'm sorry, what was that?
What is the collective?
I think there's the collective of just the number of individuals who are interested in seeing the metaverse, right? So you have people who go all the way to the extreme of, let's completely recreate reality, to people who are interested in pushing new hardware, people who are interested in pushing new software and new technologies. And everybody is collaborating and having conversations together on their best practices, on the technologies. And more often than not, when I say the collective, what I mean is that it is, I'm a producer at a collective called Making 360. And the number of us that are part of this collective, we're producing VR pieces all over the world with a number across different industries. But we all also work in different companies as well. So simply because you're working at JAUNT, or if you're working at Within, or you're working at a number of other organizations, most likely on your off time, because you want to innovate and because you want to explore what's possible, we're all coming together to push those boundaries together.
Can I ask about, we talked about the challenges of being in the space. Talk about, and I ask each of you this, talk about the things that really turn you on in this space right now. What is the thing that gets your juices flowing the most?
Yeah, for me, I think about this space is the fact that I believe we all know, although sometimes choose not to acknowledge the fact that we are all our own media companies. The thing that draws us to social media, that draws us to the internet, to pretty much draws us back to our technology is the fact that we can make our presence known because we are our own production companies. So for me, being able to empower people with the effective influence of virtual reality and turning them into Sherpas, I can invite you into the experience of my life with a 360 camera, whether that's in sunny days, running around having fun at the Oregon eclipse, or if that is responding to floods and disasters. And because it's my personal experience, it is a bit more unfiltered. And I think the idea that we can try and control the story is trying to hold on to an anchor of a time that we are rapidly leaving behind.
So you can't really affect the story. You really don't edit VR, right? You effectively put images together, but you don't cut from a wide shot to a tight shot to a medium shot. You don't really. How do you get from change time and place, for example? What is the quickest way, the best way, the easiest way, and the way that looks the most organic to change time and place in VR?
Well, I do think you edit VR, and I think it's a matter of maybe it's not, you're changing architectures and landscapes and proximities to characters. You have a whole lot of tools to create variance and subjectivity across your shots. It's just not the ones you're maybe most familiar with.
So what is the key differentiator to make from a director's perspective that makes you look at what it is you, the director, wants them to look at? Or do you even have that as an issue?
Well, I think as you mentioned,
You're
sound.
shaking your head down there one way and you're... go ahead first of all, Patrick.
Sound is like the first thing people think of. Directional audio, you have spatial audio, and you can create cues to cause people to look around. I think something that, in the early days it was, don't move the camera, but actually movement can be very powerful. And, when you have a direction to movement, I think that, kind of asks people to look forward, but also you give them a lot more variety over the course of a shot to kind of soak in different aspects of things. And then, depending on the level of control you have of the scenario, you can use things like lighting and blocking to kind of help with that. If you have a newscaster, they can, we've done a number of things with ABC News.
You're not going to go into the aftermath of Charlottesville and light it and block it.
No. I think that, I agree with you. I do think that VR needs to be edited. And I do think that even though you don't do shot sequencing in a traditional way, you do want to focus the attention of your viewer. I don't think it's the goal of 360 to have them sort of whipping around trying to find something interesting to look at. I think the 360 is what gives them the feeling of being there, but then you still need to have some sort of centralized action in your frame that they are discovering either by looking around or, as you said, using audio or some other sort of cue that often helps them to find the part of the scene that requires their attention. Just like in real life, just because I can see behind me doesn't mean that I'm looking behind me at the moment. So it's a matter of trying to keep an interesting part of the frame consistent throughout the experience, I think.
And I think it's the good point of the one thing you don't want is, so the first thing people always shoot in 360 is stuff going on in every direction. And really you want to create like a choreography through your editorial that the person has a comfortable experience of, maybe they have one rotation across 20 shots, but they're slowly led through that. Or, I think creating that comfortable experience is also important to just getting people into it and understanding.
I was just going to say, so I think VR definitely needs to be, or 360 does need to be edited. It's storytelling is still storytelling, so shot to shot to shot in some narratively driven sequence. But there are, all sorts of tricks in the post-production side of it where you can put little creeps and crawls and moves on the video without the user or the audience member touching the screen or looking around. So we took an approach for USA Today where we put 3 cameras on one of the America's Cup boats, and is the Oracle team as it got ready to defend for this year's
And
America's
that's the
Cup.
video that's on.
That's on there.
On the.
And we talk in terms of 12 o'clock. So in the post, the first shot you see, yes, we might have made that editorial decision. And if we put a creep on it to sort of hint to look over there or whatever, then fine. But the idea that somebody can look at that piece of video and not touch the screen, that 12 o'clock to 12 o'clock to 12 o'clock still was as compelling as if it were a piece of 2D video, that was important to us.
Yeah.
And it was through the discovery process. So you're focused on the action. We were not afraid of putting cameras on people, on the skipper, so that you are moving through a space. It might be frenetic and crazy, but you're there. And you're on a moving vehicle. So it was a combination of fixed.
I didn't find that to be a problem when I was looking at
Right.
it. And I actually thought it was spectacularly done.
So the idea, so we backed up a second on our just go back to old-fashioned storytelling and production techniques, took that out with various 360 cameras, cut it together as if we were telling a story, and when you look at it, you end up going back to looking at it again and again, because, oh, by the way, I can look at the top of this, or I can look what's happening off the back of the boat, or whatever. So loosening up the kind of constraints of what we think VR might strap us with, and just sort of say, hey, let's just tell stories. Let's just cut a piece of video. Let's just put it out there and see what happens. That's sort of where we're coming from to a certain degree.
So, Erika, I'm going to give you the final word on the panel before we go out and ask the audience. And thank you all for staying. It's like great because most everybody stayed. I guess we were speaking some pretty good stuff. Erika, last word.
Yeah, I think that as we're thinking about the exploration of storytelling in virtual reality, we're thinking about unscripted. Specifically on this panel, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're really, what we're looking at is experiential, right? The kind of embodied cognition, the kind of information that's coming across by 360 is not only the story. You can develop story with a voiceover narrative, with different indicators. When I'm putting together a piece, I like to think of it more like walking through a museum. Where you have a path that you can follow with lots of things to look at, but where an audience member chooses to look is completely up to them. So just keeping in mind a lot of the ethics, the production, the story, this unscripted experience of being in an environment and what that means for an individual, and how they get to be part of that and making them part of that story.
I think that's a great place to leave the panel discussion. So really terrific talking with all of you. Thank you very much. So Jason, Farkas, Patrick, Meegan, Michael Santiago, Michael Dutton, and Erika Barraza. So questions? Yes.
Hi, I was so interested in what you said, Erika, about, as I took it, fact-checking by checking the metadata to see if your acquired footage has been altered. How long does that take?
So what we're working on still in development, but it's really leveraging the power of the blockchain. If you're familiar with how that technology works.
Boy, when you said blockchain, immediately the room went.
Yeah, it feels as heavy as a chain, right? The thing about it is, think about it as a ledger, right? So when a transaction happens in your checkbook, it's there and you recognize it. And so when content is uploaded, there's a lot of metadata on a digital asset. There's location, there's the original file, descriptions, all these things. And that gets immediately locked into that ledger. And then what happens with blockchain is the ledger will redistribute it into the entire chain, so that only if you have a verification code can you actually pull all that information back together. So if people are making adjustments to it, you can see the number of times that digital asset has been changed because it's different from the original. And this is important mainly because Google about a month ago revealed that they've figured out a visualization software algorithm where they can completely remove watermarks off of digital images. So those are no longer safe if that's all you're using to lock down your digital images in your stock galleries.
So blockchain, I wrote this down, The blockchain is directly proportionate to the collective.
Yes.
I love that. Next question. Come on. Yes.
So I'm working on a 360 series where I am putting cameras in the hands of young people. I have found some technical resources. I found very few ethical resources as I prepare them. So I've been giving out all of my 360 cameras to disaster responders to see how they act. And then we're now putting together what's going to go into these solar backpacks. Do you have any reference points for giving young people ethical guides to getting into 360?
Go to school.
Well, I know I'm like a member of some Facebook groups. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of offhand, but I'd have to like go look at which ones they are. But it is a conversation that I think goes on consistently in this space.
Yeah.
So, not just simply in news and documentary. It's it's porn and video games versus storytelling and meaningful experiences.
Well, I mean, there was so much that we could have discussed here, though, about non-scripted. We could have talked sports, we could have talked music, we could have talked live versus recorded. So, I mean, this is such a huge conversation to have. But certainly out here in Los Angeles and in New York, there are places where kids are being taught how to do it. There's a school in Sherman Oaks, a high school in Sherman Oaks that's spending a lot of time teaching that.
We
And
teach it in Oakland, but teaching it in Dominican Republic or Mexico or Peru is a whole different situation when we're dealing with cacao farmers. We're dealing with young people who work in fields. And they haven't
that's a different story.
necessarily had- Yeah.
So Ivo, so I did a project in Rio de Janeiro last year during the Olympics, and we were working in an innovation hub in the heart of the favelas, and we ran a number of workshops teaching them how to film and shoot in 360 and some of the considerations. The ethical conversation it's a bit difficult just because of the kind of environments that these kids are growing up in. Their judgment of what is ethical is already in question, unfortunately. But one of the tactics that we found was actually putting them out there, having them produce a piece, and then that same afternoon putting their peers to see it, right? And letting them see, like, okay, if you decided you wanted to twirl around in a circle holding onto the 360 camera and you thought that was a good idea, this is what it did to your friend and how dizzy they get. And all of a sudden, okay, now you feel bad because their friend didn't want to even see it or look at it. So that kind of direct, immediate feedback loop was, but again, I think it comes more down to the root. If you're using personal judgment, where is the baseline of that beginning? And that's really the challenge I've found out in the field.
yes, sir.
I come from a quality control company who work in traditional home entertainment media like Blu-ray, DVD, and then also like mastering, QC, master files. And I'm really surprised that so far, we met a lot of people, but there doesn't seem to be a spot for QC in a VR workflow. And I don't know if that's just a budget reason or a time reason, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on, when we'll see that, because the pieces we have looked at, we've made some pretty significant contributions to the consumer experience of that piece, both with 360 video and also software-based experiences. So it seems like there's a big need for QC in VR. There's just not a lot of VR QC going on.
I mean, I know, John, we do a lot of QC, but it was definitely trial by fire, and we're streaming, so compression rates. I mean, we're just at the bleeding edge of, or do we do H.265 or H.264? And so from compression all the way through, it's become a necessity to have internal. I would assume a lot of folks are, just because you do realize, oh, this looks different on this screen versus this screen versus this. There's no standards to this right now.
That's got to be.
It's brutal.
That's got to be the biggest issue when it comes to QC in the digital world anyway, is the number of different types of devices that end up. Look, just because it ends up on a screen doesn't mean that it's the same content that goes to that screen is going to every other screen. And I think, interestingly enough, I heard one panelist yesterday talking about holographic IR VR. So that's something that might take us to a new level. So VR without goggles. I think that's a realistic possibility. Have you heard about that? What are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think VR's got a long road ahead. I do think it's an inevitable kind of part of our digital landscape, but I know when I was in grad school with a lot of the NASA VR guy, so this was like when the wave starting up again, talking to those guys, like, well, we've seen this before, we'll see when it, but, you know, the contact lens stuff, I know that, who knows what Magic Leap's doing, but they're supposed to be projecting into your eyes.
I'm wondering if they know what they're doing. I'm sure they do. Anyone invest in Magic Leap in the room?
Well, and another consideration to your QC question is another difficult thing is from a business-to-business standpoint, what are the quality control metrics? They differ from each of our clients. So, for example, we worked with HSBC Bank, who is sponsoring the Open Golf Tournament in the UK, and they wanted to film Onreich Stenson walking up to a child who was watching a video, a 360 video that we produced in a headset, and then surprise them. So the original video that we had, they were just focused on Facebook metrics. They wanted to see, that's how we judged the value and the success of this deal, is how many views is this gonna get on a 360 video on Facebook. And for us, we were able to achieve a good amount of combining the original experience of filming him in the UK, talking about, you know, playing in this tournament, and then having him walk up and having a separate video where he walks up and surprises the child. The child's like amazed that he's sitting right in front of him after, you know, he talks to him about VR. That's totally different than when we were working with the Denver Broncos and they said the file has to be a certain size because we know the metrics of how long someone will be willing to wait for a download. So now the QC process is completely different, and now we're managing file sizes, but we couldn't have one metric and say the file size has to be this, and it can only be this length based on the length of the video.
Nothing is ever that easy.
Yeah, it's very, it flows from experience to experience, so that's why I think it's hard to have those kind of straight protocols that everyone can kind of sit through, and now you have a QC manager who's got a set of metrics that you can go, okay, here's how we manage the quality of the video. It's just so different for each medium.
I mean, we do 37 different transcode varieties on any given file, and that's still not enough. You probably need about like 80 varietals of transcodes.
Well, I can't think of a way to end this than to be talking about the varietals of the transcode. But I just want to thank everybody on the panel because it was fascinating and we could have talked about this for another 6 hours. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Take your Google Cardboard home. Go download the app. Take a look at the stuff on JAUNT. Take a look at CNN stuff. Mesmerise. Some really, really great stuff. LaDuma. Thank everybody. See you later.